Hailing from rural New Hampshire, short story writer and novelist Allegra Hyde's thoughtful work grapples with ideas and issues surrounding utopia, idealism, ecology, colonization, and what it means to live in modern America. She earned a Bachelor of Arts from Williams College and a Master of Fine Arts from Arizona State University, and currently teaches creative writing at Oberlin College. Her debut short story collection, Of This New World, won the John Simmons Short Fiction Award through the Iowa Short Fiction Award Series, and her stories have been awarded 3 Pushcart Prizes. Her first novel, Eleuthera, is forthcoming from Vintage Books, along with a second short story collection, The Last Catastrophe. Hyde's writing blends lyricism, humor, history, science, and folklore to create vivid and sometimes bizarre landscapes in which characters wrestle with the evasiveness of paradise. So without further ado, let's welcome Allegra Hyde to the 14th Annual Literary Festival.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. That was such a kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here at this reading. It's an honor. Really grateful to John Persley and Clemson University and all the students and other folks who have helped put the event together. So my plan is to read from my story collection Of This New World, and I'll read 2 short pieces and then an excerpt from a longer piece. As you heard from Caitlin, I like to write about utopian endeavors. I'm always interested in people who are pursuing ideals or wrestling with ideals, losing paradise in some way. And that's what I'll be reading about in a sense. Yeah, I guess I will start. So the first story that I'm going to read is called After the Beginning. After the beginning, even 7 days out, my husband still made me crazy. We had been given a pile of sheepskins upon our expulsion. That was all. That and the promise of eternal suffering. My husband seemed unable to get over this. 7 days out, and by mid-morning, he still lay sprawled across the fleecy blankets lining our lean-to. I had built the lean-to. I had set pine boughs against a low branch to suggest some semblance of a separation between the wilderness and us. A weak defense against new dangers. Yes, I remember when there was only one danger, but a defense nonetheless. By noon, though, the pine boughs could not keep out the sun. Light jabbed between branches, waking my husband. He groaned and stretched his legs. His thigh muscles quivered. Put something on, I hissed, adjusting my own leafy apron. He tugged a sheepskin across his lap and looked away, still unwilling to speak to me. Yes, I remember disregarding that first danger. Even so, I told him I'd found a place to cultivate some food. I told him that without his labor, we would never survive. I told him that he had to, he needed to, get up. He still said nothing. I decided to be good then, to feel shame and be bent by it. My daydreaming made this difficult. I could not gather reeds or collect firewood or mend the lean-to without drifting into other places. To that lush, ambrosial garden, the once warm cavern of my husband's embrace. All morning, I swatted flies and images. To concentrate, I clutched tight to my guilt. I gave myself more chores. And yet, even as I wove reeds in the lacy shade of apple trees. They were everywhere, those trees, growing wild and wormy like unfunny jokes. I could not resist looking across the field to where my husband stood, head bowed, lost in his thoughts. "Gardens don't grow on their own," I called, a reminder, I suppose, that neither of us needed. My husband stabbed a stick in the soil, ignoring me. I gave up on weaving reeds and went back to fetching firewood. All day, my husband tilled the soil sulkily. By late afternoon, his skin had turned red and raw from sun. His flesh was glossed with sweat. "At your rate," I said, "maybe we'll have something to eat in 3 years." "Rah!" he yelled, at last throwing the stick down and striding into the forest. Even as he disappeared, even as my own fingers bled from dryness and blisters, I dreamed. I thought about the intersections of our bodies, of shadows blooming in the sticky convergence of hip to hip. My husband returned at nightfall, bruised, bee-stung, covered in mud, empty-handed. I wanted to laugh at the mess, the way we used to giggle at everything. There was a time when a bee sting would have been hilarious, even beautiful. My husband slunk into the lean-to and curled up among the sheepskins, silent. There were only apples to eat. We had been eating them raw for 7 days. This must have been part of our punishment. To find ourselves nauseous from the sweet flesh, to start hating the snap of teeth through skin, the bite once wrongly desired. But there was nothing else to eat. So that night I smashed the fruit together and placed it on a flat rock near the fire. "We should name this," I said, presenting the warm mush to my husband. Words in those days could still be plucked out of the air. "How about," I paused, awaiting the mouth tingle of a new sound. "How about pie?" He smiled, an expression I had not seen in days, and chewed slowly. This would be the first thing we had named since our expulsion. I watched my husband, his face illuminated by our bonfire, his eyes tracing the arc of my collarbone, the curve of my breasts, the nakedness he'd only recently learned to see. I will be good. I will feel shame and be bent by it. That night, we lay together on the pile of sheepskins, alone in a forest of shrieks and howls. I listened to the creatures outside, clawed and toothed, among which I'd once roamed freely. There were so many dangers now, so many clefts and cracks in the walls of our lean-to, so little we could do. That night, our limbs entwined, my husband breathed softly, deeply. And me, I dreamt of fields of grain and wicker baskets and paradise. And that is that story. All right. So my next piece is called Acid, and it is a story that reflects the research, quote unquote, that I did as a fiction writer, visiting a lot of hippie communes. I have a long-term interest in intentional communities and spent a while backpacking around them, especially in New Zealand. And in some ways trying to be a hippie, but never quite being able to pull it off. So this is an homage in a way to that lifestyle. So acid. You'll say it was because your parents didn't understand you, that's why you left. But really, it's because they understood you too well. They looked at you, their daughter, the way they read labels in the grocery store, all the ingredients adding up. They watched you with faint, serious joy playing across their faces. Sally Sunshine, people call you now, the other hippies and runaways and spirit seekers. Sally Sunny Sunshine, they say, because you hardly ever stay inside. You sit in the sun until your fair skin burns, the heat branding your shoulders, your cheeks, your nipples when you go topless, burning until the skin blisters and peels. The skin, it lifts off the surface of your arms like a pale, thin rust. Sally, Sally Sunshine, the others sing, what are you going to do today? How good it feels to be misunderstood, to be looked at as something unknowable. You do things to keep them guessing. You do things to keep yourself guessing. You're so young, says one of the men, another sour-smelling, matted-haired man. You grab his crotch and look him straight in the eyes and laugh. The house belongs to an old artist. He has a long beard and skin like a raisin, and sometimes he disappears into the desert, then comes back and makes tea and sits on the porch, still staring into the desert. You aren't sure he even realizes everyone else is there. You are a queen. Your hair is loose and ropey, your skin burned. You wear a long dress and let it drag behind you. You walk barefoot everywhere. You step on burrs, in coyote shit, on nails. You don't care. That is part of your mystery, how little you care. You are an animal. You burrow into pillows. You speak only in howls. You are a pure thing. You do what you want. You do not help clean. You do not help cook. You won't say sorry. Sometimes the others talk about ideals, freedom, equality, peace. You like the sound of the words. You like that you can put the words in your pocket, let them jangle alongside raven feathers, an old penny, a bullet casing, things that seem both precious and worthless. Categorical, says the old man, the artist, rocking on the porch. He looks out into the desert. He looks and looks and looks. There are the mountains, naked, scrubbed to brown, everything naked, too hot for anything else. And the smoke, the sweat smells, the candle burning, bare feet, ringing bells. Even now it's in your brain, your parents' words, like acid, worming inside you. Sally, they used to say, our brave little girl, our smart little girl, you're gonna do big things, you're gonna do important things. And how it pains you, remembering this, how it makes you writhe and dance and press your fingers into the sharp ends of Swarrow spines, thinking, knowing that they still might be right. And that is that one. So the last piece that I'm gonna read is an excerpt from the longest story in the collection, which is called Shark Fishing. And I wanted to read from this piece because although shark fishing was the longest story in the collection and took up the most real estate, it was a story that I couldn't let go of. I kept thinking about this place, an island in the Bahamas, and a group of environmentalists living there, trying to address climate change, but also in many ways perpetuating long-term patterns of colonialism and exploitation. Couldn't let it go. And ultimately, years later, it became my first novel, Eleutheria, which I'm excited to say will be out next year. So this reading will be a sneak preview of that forthcoming novel. The part that I'm going to read from this story is when the story's protagonist, Dawn, has arrived on the island, having never been there, but having arrived with the intention of joining this group of militant environmentalists. Inside the airplane, inside the sky, window ovals opening into aquamarine, and oceans spread blank and blissful below, except for a few dark patches you realize later are the shadows of clouds. The plane hovers there too, toy-sized and skimming the surface. And then, closer to land, sandbars swoop up, white and dreamy, like spilt milk. There, Eleuthera, that skinny spit, that fish hook bathing. The toy plane glides over pink pebbled beaches and acres of palm trees, above the square stamp of rooftops and swimming pools resigned to a viridescent shimmer. It dips to pineapple fields, bent and overgrown, tobaccos abandoned mid-push in the dense coppice that jostles cinder block settlements right up to the tiny airport in Rock Sound, the only one left after Pan Am disappeared, and it feels as though you might disappear as well. I wound up at Camp Hope by luck, or fate. In those days, I didn't bother with distinctions. One minute, I was in a single bulb basement in Brooklyn, printing pamphlets on climate justice in an age of corporate tyranny. The next, I was stepping onto the parched tarmac of the Eleutherian airport, about to work for a man I'd never met, wishing I still felt the same reckless confidence I'd flaunted to friends back home. Waiting on the tarmac, Mr. Roy Adams. My new boss and Camp Hope's founder, he was also, at least according to rumors on the activist circuit, a former Navy SEAL turned born-again tree hugger, baptized in the warm waters of the Caribbean. He wore aviators, a crew cut, and steel-toed boots. Not my usual company, not by a long shot. Let's go. Adams grabbed my duffel bag and chucked it into the back of a bug-smeared Jeep. Then he swung himself into the driver's side. For a moment, I considered refusing, catching the next plane back to New York. How could I work for a man who didn't even bother shaking hands? Having spent the last decade volunteering for Field Corps, a loose collective of urban eco-activists, occasionally anarchic, always up in arms, I was used to groupthink sessions that began with hugs and ended in drum circles, not two-syllable commands. Dawn, said Adams. He was watching me through the Jeep's windshield, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, as if I were an animal he'd already corralled. I wanted out of that gaze, out of the sun's dizzying heat, and yet I thought of the offer Adams had made on the phone 4 weeks earlier. Dawn, he'd said, your work on that BP protest, impressive stuff, but don't you ever think about taking things further, living the solution? Living the solution. Sure, I'd imagined it. We all did at Field Corps. We talk about getting a chunk of land, starting an eco-centered society, proving one could exist beyond the American standard operating procedure. of morning commutes and disposable Starbucks cups. But the talk had always stayed abstract, a hash-fumed fantasy. That is, until Adams called and offered me a job. Camp Hope, he'd said, will be part school, part eco base camp. We're aiming to be 100% self-sufficient within 2 years. With wind turbines, aquaculture, the whole deal. And we've already got a roster of students, or more specifically their tuition. Now we just need teachers, people who believe in sustainability, people like you. People like you, who as I except someone who had always been willing to train. Hot here, I said, sliding into the Jeep's passenger side, the vinyl seat burning the back of my thighs. I bit back a yelp, adding, barely 50 in New York when I left. Adams grunted, then rummaged in his pockets for keys. It occurred to me then that he might have his own reservations. On the phone, he'd said that I came highly recommended, but he'd also repeated the need for full-on commitment, that he needed doers, not just dreamers, no wishy-washy hippie stuff. As demonstrated in my earlier story. Apparently, several recruits for his Eco Dream Team had already dropped out. With my rumpled t-shirt and matted hair, I could hardly look inspiring. Perhaps my ex-girlfriend, a lipsticked NYU professor with a penchant for soft bohemian women, had been right to smirk as she watched me pack. Perhaps she'd been right to remind me in her creamy voice that I'd never held a real job for more than a month. I felt nauseated. Heat shimmered off the tarmac, blearing the tangle of trees and blossoms beyond. Adams revved the Jeep's engine. Unexpectedly, I smelled French fries. That biodiesel? I asked out of habit. Adams turned to me, sunshine gilding his aviators, so that for a moment he appeared both blinding and holy. Then he answered, "They said you were good," and stomped on the accelerator, sending us careening toward Camp Hope. I'm gonna jump ahead a bit. My first eyeful of Camp Hope felt like a fever dream, a sight so gorgeous it hurt. Strung along the beach stood dormitories and classrooms, a dining hall and a library, low, breezy buildings, all freshly whitewashed, and beside them, garden plots with melon leaves, carrot tops, pole beans. Solar panels bowed to the sun. Wind turbines pirouetted in the breeze. A citadel to sustainability. "You weren't kidding," I breathed, standing beside Adams. "This is something." Adams thrust his hands into his pockets like an oversized boy trying to be modest. "It's getting there," he said, then paused. Nearby, several builders sat in the shade of leafy bananas. "Are they local?" Adams ignored me, instead calling to the men. "Finished already?" as they scrambled upright. "Don't strain yourself, Dwayne." Adams strode in among them, thumping the sweaty back of the slowest. "I'm in the market for more shark bait." Dwayne, or the man who'd been called Dwayne, stiffened. Adams released a gunshot laugh. "I'm just messing with you," he said, grinning until the others grinned with him. Again, I felt a wave of doubt. And I'm gonna pause or end my reading there. Thank you so much for listening and being an audience.